Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Horse Geeks podcast, where we look at horses and riding from the inside out. I'm Kirsten Nelsen, a professional horse trainer, and with me is Deb Romero, certified Alexander Technique instructor. And we love talking about things from the inside out. I don't think it gets enough play. And our topic today was, what does engagement mean? And we may get to that, but before we started the meeting, Deb and I both had interesting weeks and started to look at even our motivation of why we're doing what we're doing. And I got really fatigued last week. I had a week where I had to kind of cancel some lessons and take a bit of a rest break and work on some of this written material I'm doing for a course coming up. But I realized this morning what sort of started this possibly alternative podcast today to our plan
Side tour.
was yeah, a little bit of a detour. Why not? Was sort of thinking this morning, having a quiet morning, that, when we're kids, our lives are sort of dictated by our parents, our teachers, the adults, the authorities. And I wondered this morning if that was still a habit I was keeping with me. And I think I am. So we'll talk about that. But I
Yeah.
went, I remember thinking as a kid, I can't wait until I can make my own decisions. I can't wait until I have more freedom. I can't wait until things are more in my control. And now here I am, well into being adult, and I still feel that pressure of,
Wow.
I've got to do this for this person or that for that person, or, and it's like finding the me time, or
Mm.
not only finding the me time, but sort of I took a long pause this week because I wasn't feeling well. So I took a long pause and went, am I really arranging my life the
Oh,
way that serves me the best? Am I really making decisions that are good for me? And if we talk about our horses, it's like, are we following a particular trainer or a particular method that's really
mm.
working for us? Or are we sort of doing it to meet external expectations or some kind of external pressure that's for somebody else more than it's for us?
Wow.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. And that just gets my brain rolling around. I was seeing on Facebook, there's a lot of horse shows going on
Mm,
around here. And, what is that internal drive that to get the blue ribbon? The same thing. It's like, what is that? And, because I don't have that desire anymore. I did, I have to admit. But that whole maybe it's an internal tape. Maybe it's an old tape, like you said, from growing up.
it could be like maybe we're so conditioned to the habit because I mean, we're spending from the time we're babies till the time we're at least 17, 18, 19 under authority. I
Under
remember
authority.
like turning 21 and going, oh, I'm finally an adult, right? And
I'm adulting now.
yeah, I'm adulting. And I don't know if somewhere along the line we just develop these really strong habits that's how we live life. And I think
It goes back to that podcast about what was the one we did about the dollars stepping over.
stepping over dollars to pick up pennies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's kind of like we need to I think we both, the reason we're talking about this is we both had kind of the same experience this week of, am I making healthy choices or am I just doing the do?
Right. Or even pausing long enough to go, why is this important to me?
Ah,
And I found
bleh.
there's kind of a first layer to the answer, especially if
Mm.
it's your job. It's like, well, I got to make money to survive. That's the first easy answer,
Oh, good point.
right? But I go, then why am I doing this job? How do I,
Exactly.
or why am I making money this way? How's that working for me? And it was a big turning point with me in with my horses and horse training was when I wanted the blue ribbon and I was really driven to compete. when I looked at it very deeply, it was a way to prove my value. It was a way to
Mm,
prove that I was good. It was a way to prove my worthiness if I could win the blue ribbon, right? And that's
yeah.
just me. I don't know other people's motivation. And when I started to go, well, is it good for my horse? What's
Mm,
more important for me, winning the blue ribbon at the expense of my relationship with the horse or at the expense of my horse's soundness? Or do I really want this relationship with my horse and my horse to be healthy and sound, whether or not anybody else on the planet even notices? You know, it's like
what do we call ourselves? We're on the island of
misfit toys.
yeah. we maybe we both really felt like we were on our own little islands this week. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, because anything that we want, we all have a list of, we could easily write down 10 things that we want that we don't have now, right? Everybody can do that. But when we look at our list of wants, most of our wants are to give us a feeling,
Oh,
right? So it's like, okay, we want money so that we feel safe and secure, or
right.
we want money so that we have more freedom, right? So it's like the feeling behind the want is sort of the deeper dive.
Yeah, it is.
And if we go, why do I want a horse? Why do I want to ride? It's like, did we ever really even ask ourselves that question? And
Wow.
when I started to ask myself that question, everything I did with horses pivoted. It was a big life change when I went, wow, the way I'm riding could be constructive or destructive to my horse. My relationship could
Mhm.
be challenged or enhanced by what I'm choosing to do with my horse. And my horse has very little choice on that. They're just going to react to whatever I decide to do with who they are. But I went, sometimes if we don't take a step back and sort of look at what is it I want to feel? Like what's the feeling goal behind the thing I want, right?
That's really interesting because my husband always says when I'm in a bad mood, he says, go to the barn. You're a much nicer person when you come back from the barn. And so
Yes.
what is that? There's that connection, I think, or and really we're still doing something with the horse or for the horse.
Yeah, I mean, we're always doing something. So what I kind of considered this week was, am I doing something out of a habit? Because when I
Mm,
do, I don't really notice that I'm doing a habit. What I experience is this sense of pressure. Like I
ooh,
kind of get a weight, like this sense of pressure. Like you got to get up, you got to get this done, you got to get to this appointment, you got to get that done, blah, blah, blah. And I go, yeah, you got to maintain your house and life. And there's certain things you have to do. But it's like, how much, how often? I guess that was my question. How often do I get that sense of pressure or
mm,
do I get a sense of enjoyment? And that's where I had to kind of rethink, why am I doing what I'm doing, or what's my motivation behind what I'm doing?
it's a good question.
Yeah, and it opens up a little bit, I guess, Pandora's box. It
I
just
think it does.
depending on what you're looking at, whether it's your job or your
Do we
horse or
really
your
want to look at that? Do we
showing.
really want to open that door?
Yeah. But I go, sometimes our habits are not efficient and they're not really serving us. Sometimes our habits are part of what's generating that feeling of pressure. And we forget that we have choice. We forget as adults, maybe. Like that's what sort of hit me was I go, well, nobody's telling me what to do. Of course I have responsibilities, but I can organize how I want to take care of those responsibilities.
Exactly. We forget that. We forget
Hmm.
that level of choice. Um, and that's like when you walk into a room and somebody says, have a seat. Well, that can be a choice.
Right.
I mean, something as simple as that we don't think about. And I've done that. And I'll say, no, thank you. I'd rather stand. And they'll say, are you okay? Does your back hurt or something? And I'm like, no, actually, I just want to stand. Thank you. So it's
And
everywhere.
that feels so awkward. And
It
that's what I mean
does.
from the time when we're growing, we're so deeply conditioned to respond to the other by pleasing and doing what's asked because that's what kept us out of trouble. Whether it was healthy for us or not didn't
That's a
matter.
good point.
You know what I mean? It
That's a
just
good
kept us out
point.
of trouble. Whether we liked it or not didn't matter. And so it's like children, like horses, there's not a lot of choice because you're being guided by authority all the time. You don't get to choose where you live. You can't always choose when to go to bed, when to eat, when to, all of those choices are kind of made for you. And I think we forget as we age that that choice becomes more and more ours.
That's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Are we guided? Are we being guided by habits or choice?
Right.
That's a big one. And how often do we check in? Like you said, check in with ourselves. How often do we look at ourselves from the inside?
Right. Which,
We usually have to run into some sort of a wall, a wake-up call, whatever that is.
or like for me, it was just exhaustion. It was like, I'm just so fatigued. Why am I so fatigued? I'm living a life that I did choose consciously. I love what I do. But I go, so where's the fatigue coming from? Am I just doing too much, or am I feeling pressure from being pulled different directions rather than really doing what I'd like to do? And I think that's maybe just a good question that comes up when we get tired or we feel run down. It's like, what choices am I making for me versus how often am I living because of the external pressures of what I have to do?
Yeah, I'm getting this vision of elementary school and stand in line. You get in alphabetical order. Oh my God.
Yes, yes. Much like inside leg to outside rein, and your horse will be perfect. It's like, yeah. And so it kind of leads us to our topic a little bit because what popped in my mind were the rules of engagement.
Oh, I know, right?
And I go, so what
Rules.
is engagement? And rules of engagement are sort of like the rules we learn or the habits we form engaging with the world, engaging with other people.
Mm.
Right. And when I looked up the definition of engagement for this podcast, almost every definition, if you just go to Webster, was about getting married.
I saw that too.
And I was like, really? So I had to put engagement horse, right?
That's what I did. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when I searched engagement horse, what was so interesting is I go, oh, wow, like this is everything under that. When you do a Google search, there's some similarities no matter which website you open. Almost all of them, and I think you sent me a post about this too.
Yeah.
That
I
it's
sent
the
you an article.
bending of the hind legs
I loved
is
that.
engagement. That
I
it's
loved that.
a weight shift to the hind end. That it's the hind legs closer to center. And I even read impulsion is the ability to spring out of engagement. And
That
I
was
went,
interesting.
all of those to me are very difficult to ascertain. And it's so general when I read these definitions that I go, no wonder we're all confused about engagement. No wonder. And
Well,
so,
even I know I've heard it at least 100 times, engage the horse. What does that mean?
right. And so if you go by the definition of leg bending, what that's led to in training is over flexing and overextending the legs. And this is where that term tracking up comes from, right? That you want to see the hind hoof land in the print of the front hoof. And that somehow means your horse is engaged because the hind leg is coming all the way forward to where the front legs are, theoretically.
Theoretically, but I'm not getting a good picture around that.
So the first thing with engagement is tracking up means zero. It
Exactly.
means nothing. So people who are looking at tracking up as an indicator of engagement, I go, it's so far off the mark, it's not even funny. Because if you're just looking at where the hind hoof is landing relative to the hoof print of the front leg, which is tracking up, if the hind hoof lands in the front hoof print, then somehow the hindquarter is engaged. And I go, no, because if the horse is severely on the forehand,
exactly,
then the front hoof isn't going to take off. It's going to
be
push
behind
backwards.
them, sort of. Yeah.
Right. So when the weight's on the forehand, the front legs go way too far back, which makes it quite easy for the hind leg to track up into the front leg hoof print because the front leg's not getting off the ground because it's so overloaded. You can also have, like in a gaited horse, you can have a high mobility.
Yes.
Right. Which is just a looseness of the joints, kind of a excessive mobility, like a person who's double jointed.
The hypermobile person is actually more prone to injury than one who's not.
Right. And so a lot of gaited horses genetically have that hypermobility. And so they'll easily put their hind hoof in the front hoof print or even over track. And they're completely disengaged and unstable in the hindquarters, but they still do that. So as soon as somebody tells me, oh, look at the tracking up, I just go, I don't listen anymore, or I redirect. If it's a student, we start there. If it's somebody telling me how good the horse is going, I just walk away because I go, not a clue, right? Tracking up, mythbuster number one, it means nothing. It means nothing when it comes to engagement.
Number one.
Right. So the only definition I found in Webster that I thought actually relates to engagement on many levels is a state of being in gear.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you actually use the term engagement when it comes to people. And the term I hear the most is engage the core muscles. So what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Right. What does that mean when you say engage your core? Because that's as ephemeris as engage the horse's hindquarter. Like the first thing I do or people do is suck it in, it's like suck in the belly as hard as you can. And somehow you're engaging the core.
And that's so interesting because I try not to work in isolation, but even if you just look anatomically at the human, the abdominal muscles wrap all the way around to the back. I mean, it's not just this one little space up front by your belly button kind of thing. But to take it to a level of it support and tone instead of, it's all, we've talked about this before, the language we use sometimes really gets us in trouble. But sometimes we have to isolate just as a beginning, we've got to start somewhere.
Right. But it's, what does it mean when a person is engaged? How would you define that? Like what would happen either in the bone, mechanically with the bones, or the use of the muscle, or what's the purpose? Why would somebody want to be engaged as a person?
That is a great question. I read, there was a horse body worker that talked about this on Facebook that I read. And I think you'll agree with horses. It really, the central nervous system is the key. Because if the central nervous system isn't happy, it's going to send out signals to the muscles and the bones and the joints. We're not right. And it could be something as subtle as the week we had, or, it could be you have an arched back and you're in agony, so I think it goes when the central nervous system, the closer we get to the engagement, and I mean that mentally and physically, because I've certainly worked on people as a massage therapist that we call was completely disconnected from the neck down.
Disengaged from their own body, living in their head.
Yeah. And then there has to be a big traumatic thing that happens to them to be a wake-up call. And I think we also do that with our horses.
Yeah. And just to clarify, like for a horse, when people say engage the hindquarters, mechanically, there's a couple of things that can happen. You can increase the upward force of the spine in a horse or increase flexion of the spine, and that will rotate the pelvic bone, articulating the legs further forward towards the center of the horse's body, right? So your hip joint, stifle joint, hock joint, and fetlock are all going to go through a greater range of motion. That doesn't just mean increasing flexion, but also increasing extension. So flexion just describes a joint where the bones are coming closer together, and extension just means the bones of a joint are moving farther apart. So longitudinal flexion is when the bottom of the horse's spinal bones, the vertebra, are coming closer together, which is what creates the upward force of the spine. So when you increase flexion in a horse's back, it will rotate the pelvic bone more forward and place the hind legs deeper towards the center of the horse's body. But you can also have more engagement without necessarily having to lift the back first in order to get it. So engagement, I really like the term state of being in gear, right? So that's where there's a connection so that you have control, right? If you go up a gear, you're still engaged in a higher gear for more speed. But if you downshift, you're in a lower gear, maybe for more control.
Yeah, I like that.
Right? So for a horse, you can't just look at the legs because it happens faster than the human eye can decipher. For every stride of a horse's leg, you go through, like, let's say the hind leg is coming forward. Before the hoof lands, the whole leg joint, all the leg joints are extended or opened. Then the hoof lands and begins what's called the braking phase of the stride, or just like in your car, brakes, deceleration, which is how they control their body weight in forward motion, right? So when the hoof comes forward towards the center of the body, all the joints extend, the hoof lands, all the joints flex. Then it goes to peak vertical, where all the joints extend. Then begins the pushing phase, or the acceleration phase of the stride. All the joints flex again, and then all the joints extend and flex and swing forward and extend. So you've got 4 phases of flexion and extension in the leg joints during every single stride. You can't even see that when the horse is walking.
No, we can't.
Right? So what happens is, if that becomes our way of viewing engagement of the hindquarter, we can use a whip, a stick, and manipulation to increase what we see. This is the idea of ground poles. We just see more flexion and extension, right? But it doesn't necessarily put them in gear. Sometimes it compromises their control through the hindquarter when we try to manipulate the increase of
a good word.
Flexion and extension. So it makes humans feel better to send a horse over cavalettis and ground poles, because we see the bending of the legs and we go, we must be getting more engagement. But no, the horse can do that with the back pushing down, being crooked, having the pelvis rotated the wrong way. So again, just like tracking up, I go, get your eyes off of the flexion and extension. It's not a good indicator.
Right.
And we're more likely to get it wrong than we are to get it right. So I go, you can't see the flexion of an extension equalizing in real time.
No.
You just can't.
No.
The human eye, it's impossible. You have to watch it in slow-mo.
Yeah, I like it when we watch slow-mo videos. You see a lot more because we just can't keep up.
Yeah, the human eye just can't see it at that speed.
So it's more of a, would you say it has to be more of a timing and feel? Because we've become much more seeing creatures instead of being kinesthetic creatures as humans. We're losing our function of feel.
We can do it a little bit both ways, but what engaging the horse's hindquarter, what it provides, the reason we do it, and this may be similar to humans, is when we have the spine and pelvic bones in the ideal use, what the muscles are doing is generating a forward force and balancing that with a control or resistant force that stabilizes the body during motion. So a horse that's disengaged is going to push in order to create forward motion, but they can't resist their own body weight from going to their own front legs because they're not engaged. So for the horse's well-being, yes, it gives us power for performance, but more importantly, an engaged hindquarter is how the horse stabilizes and controls their body weight during motion. That's the purpose. Even if the back isn't very lifted, we can get a minimal amount of hindquarter engagement where they push forward, but they resist falling forward onto their own front legs. Right? So that to me is the entire purpose of engagement.
Yes.
Right? So the way we see it is if they're falling forward, their head is either high and short or long and low. I go, that's the visual element. If you don't distort the head position with the use of the reins and the bit or a gadget or...
Oh, that's another whole podcast.
And that's why I don't use those kind of devices or leverage bits, because when a horse's body weight is excessively on the front legs, that means they're not engaged enough to push their body forward and prevent falling forward at the same time.
Right.
Right. So like a human going up and down a hill will feel it. It's when we take our forward stride, when our foot's out in front of us, we're resisting falling down the hill, while the leg that's behind us is creating forward motion, pushing our body forward. So we push and brake and push and resist and push and resist every stride, just like horses.
Yes.
Right. So, and this kind of comes back to tracking up. If the hind legs are not resisting the body weight during forward motion from falling to the front legs, then the front legs do the job of braking. Right. Just like if we fell forward on our arms. And that's the classic, when we fall off a horse, the classic fracture for the human is the wrist, because we put our arms out to catch our fall. Right. So that's a horse on the forehand is just leaning on their arms because they're not controlling their body weight from falling forward with their legs, which are their back legs. Right. So engagement mean being in gear, whatever gear we choose. Like in our car, if we're in first gear, we're not going very fast, but we're controlled in our acceleration and our deceleration. If we want to go faster, we increase second, third, fourth gear, right? And whether we're in a school zone or on a highway, we have brakes that are an active resistant force to the acceleration.
Yes.
We have a gas pedal that can increase acceleration, right? So it's like engagement is control over the amount of acceleration, amount of braking.
Yes. And I would get, yeah, the same thing. It's a level of tone, and it should be a place that is easy. You know, when people start to get better organized, they often say, oh, wow, this is so easy compared to the way I was walking or doing whatever. When you get that higher level of organization, you the horse, I would imagine, I know the human doesn't have to work as hard.
Yeah. So the purpose of engagement, whether it's human or horse, is self-control during motion.
Yes.
Right. So what happens when a horse loses self-control during motion and they go on the forehand? The neck either goes up and the muscles tighten upward so that they prevent falling and get some stability. Even though they're out of balance, they get stability. Or they lean on the bit, or they get behind the bit, or they just isometrically hold through the shoulder muscles, upper back, and neck muscles, because the body will find a way to stabilize. But if the
Right.
hindquarter isn't engaged enough to do its job of creating not only propulsion, but stability during propulsion, right? So the braking use of the muscles and the braking phase of the leg stride are how the horse controls their body during forward motion. That's why we need engagement.
Yes.
Right. And so if we have a horse that's heavy on the bit, if we have a horse that's dropping the pole, over curling the neck, too heavy or light on the rein contact, hard to steer, hard to slow down, hard to get going. Okay, everybody has those problems, right?
Yeah.
Those are all symptoms of the hindquarters being disengaged or not engaged enough,
Enough. Yeah.
right? So when we get a minimal amount of engagement, even if the back isn't fully lifted, it's the balance between the pushing force and the resistant force. So the horse pushes forward, but then controls its body weight from falling forward. And I've read a lot of descriptions on my Google search about how the horse shifts weight to the hind legs. And I thought that for a long time until I got deeper into learning the biomechanics. And it feels like a weight shift when you ride. It feels like they shift weight from their front legs to their hind legs when you get a minimal amount of engagement. But it's not really a weight shift. Just like we don't shift weight between if we're on the forehand, we might have more weight on our toes, but we're not shifting our weight to our heels when we get engaged.
Yeah.
Right? Because if our weight is too much on our toes or too much on our heels, we're out of balance either way.
Exactly.
We're disengaged either way.
We're disengaged.
Right? Which in the human, to me, it's sort of the alignment and stability of the pelvis that lets us use our legs. So it's kind of lumbar pelvis use in the human is how I would define engagement in a person. So if our pelvis is tipped forward, our weight's on our toes. And if our pelvis is tipped too far backwards, our weight's on our heels, which is disengaged either way.
Right.
Right. So for a horse, they don't shift weight from the front legs to the hind legs. They change the use of the pelvis related to the function of the spine, and that changes the position of the legs. So if we need to increase the forward placement of the legs, that means we have to increase braking, which is the control as well as the deceleration use of the body.
Right.
Right? Brakes are brakes. And so again, this is a little bit of another myth buster. Going faster doesn't increase engagement. It does not. Going faster, going faster increases the pushing phase of the leg, which is where the leg is behind the torso, so the pelvis is rotating backwards and the hind leg is out behind the horse during the pushing phase of the leg. So if we want the hind leg to come deeper towards the center, that's pretty consistent in all the definitions, and the one part that I would say is accurate and right. that the hind leg does have to come closer to the horse's center to be more engaged, right? We don't have to see bend, we don't have to see tracking up, but the horse's hind leg coming closer to the center is how they increase resistance of their body weight going forward, right? So it feels like a weight shift to the hind legs when you're riding because you feel the front end lighten. So you sort of assume, and you feel a little bit more traction or resistance from the hind legs. You can actually feel the hoof hitting the ground under the saddle when the horse is engaged enough that they can control their own body weight during motion. So
I'm going to start looking for that.
yeah, feeling the hoof.
I tried it, and I couldn't figure out. So I had to create a situation where I used the sun and looking at the shadow of my horse.
Yeah, or a mirror or a video.
Right. Wait,
Yeah.
What is that?
Yeah. Yeah, but the purpose of it is like a lot of horses that are going on the forehand and being managed, because what I described, too heavy on the bit, over curling the neck, dropping the pole, being too light on the bit, having issues with steering or turning, having issues with the horse going too fast and rushing or too slow with lacking forward. Those are very common issues.
Yes.
And they're all related directly to the horse not being able to control their own body weight during motion. So they're disengaged.
Yeah.
Right. I don't even have to bring the lift of the back into it. So sending a horse over ground poles doesn't help that. Whether or not,
especially with a rider on their back.
Right. And whether or not their legs are obviously flexing and extending doesn't help that. Right. So the way we see it is if the horse has freedom of use in the neck, then if they were high-headed, they start to lengthen the neck muscles and lower the head and neck. If they were long and low, they start to elevate the head and neck so that we at least get a lengthening of the neck and back muscles, and they're not putting the head too high or too low. And we're not using rein pressure or bit resistance to achieve that head position. The use of the head and neck can be a very good indicator of the use of the hindquarters.
Yeah.
Right? Because the hindquarters are meant to push the body weight forward and also control the body weight from falling forward. So when we get engagement, we don't have heaviness in the bit. We don't have bending or curling of the neck. We have better steering from the saddle and much better control over speed because the horse is controlling its own body.
I think that's the nail on the head for me with the I talked to some neighbors that went to a dressage show this weekend about, and it was interesting what they commented on, that those that were in, the beginning levels of it, the horses looked better than the upper level horses. And I went, wow, what does that speak to?
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to this whole thing of the horse, the higher up the level, the more we enforce things on them, and the horse loses its ability to balance itself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We think we know better, and humans tend to exaggerate. And so what you get are these horses in high competition that look like a dog with its tail tucked between its legs. Like that, that rotation of the pelvis is so exaggerated that it's unhealthy.
So then that's not engagement either.
No, that it just like a human pelvis, we can be too far forward or too far backwards. Right? The essential amount of engagement, even if you're a trail rider or you're just riding your horse with no particular goals, for the horse's health, they have to be engaged to a minimal amount to control their own body weight and the weight of the rider or the weight of the cart during motion. So we need a minimal amount where they just quit overloading their own front legs. right? So we could call it balance and control. Self-control over their body weight during motion is a better term, is a better definition for engagement,
I like that. Yeah, I
right?
agree.
And so we feel that in ease of steering, ease of speed adjustments, like we can shift gears in a car, we can choose the gear, right? As opposed to a horse that wants to be in fifth gear and we want to be in first gear. So we just pull back on the reins and use a bigger bit,
Right.
right? Or a horse that wants to be in first gear and we want to be in fifth gear. And so we're whipping and using spurs in our legs and we're constantly push, 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 right? So that's our human instinct, is to say, I'll just get you in that gear rather than
grind the gears.
right, right, exactly.
Forgot the clutch.
Exactly. I know. And it's funny, it's like I grew up, everybody learned how to drive a stick shift at some point. That's no longer true. But it's like, yeah, you can feel how you grind the gears when you try to force it. And that's kind of what it does to the horse's body.
Oh, good
So
point.
if we don't have enough engagement, even for pleasure riding, where the horse can control its own body weight and stabilize its body during forward motion, then we get concussive lamenesses like ring bone, side bone, navicular, things like that. Those bony changes in the front legs are from long-term overloading of the front legs, too much body weight on the front legs.
Yes.
So then the vet says, get your horse off the forehand, get him more engaged, lift his back. And you go, how do I do that? Right. And they give you advice, which some of it is not harmful and some of it is just completely useless from a trainer's perspective. Right. The vet's always going to give advice on training that's sort of theoretically safe for the body. So they're not going to tell you to do anything that's going to damage your horse further, but it might not actually make any changes. So how do we increase engagement? It's really in how the horse does transitions.
I agree.
Right? So I go, if we can do a downward transition with little to no rein pressure, then that's sort of showing that the horse can control its body weight, right? If we can do an upward transition with very light leg aids and maybe a light tap of the whip, not like if we can go from, how do I do this? Oh, usually I have people count. So if you're on a horse that doesn't have enough pushing power to be engaged, then when you put your legs on and ask for forward and you start counting to 10, you might get to 8 before the horse moves forward from a light leg aid, if ever, right?
If ever, or go backwards.
Right. But on that same horse, if you ask for a downward transition, it'll happen by the count of 1. As soon as you take your legs off, they stop.
Yes.
Right. And then if you're on the opposite kind of disengagement problem where the horse pushes too much and you're always having to slow them down with the bit, you can only count to 1 when you put your legs on and they're off, right? But you can resist with your back asking for a downward transition without rein pressure past 10, and you're still going to need the reins to get it done. Right? So if I'm like on a green horse, part of how I'm balancing the horse is when I put my legs on, 1, 2, 3, they should be moving forward at walk. When I start to resist with my back, not leaning backwards, but just applying the brakes. So the brakes are not reverse. And it's not reverse. You don't throw your car in reverse when you want to slow down.
Exactly.
You resist the forward that you have. So we become more vertical, we resist. And if the horse can follow our back with very light or very little rein pressure, and they come to a halt by the same count, say 3, right? So if I put on my legs, 1, 2, 3, the horse moves forward. Then I ask for a halt. I use my back, 1, 2, 3, little light bit of resistance on the reins, and they come to halt. That's a horse that's pretty engaged. That's a horse that can use their hindquarter to generate forward motion and resist forward motion. right? So the downward transitions are where we increase the braking, and the upward transitions are where we increase the pushing.
Mhm.
And to be engaged, which I'm going to come right back to my favorite definition, being the state of being in a gear.
Mhm.
Doesn't matter if it's first gear or fifth gear, it's a gear, right? So to be in a gear, whoa and go are equal and easy.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I like that.
if we have to use a lot of leverage to get forward and keep forward, then the horse is not engaged. If we have to use a lot of bit pressure to slow a horse down or keep a horse slow, that horse is not engaged.
Right.
So it's really, engagement is directly related to the whoa and go ability of the horse. With less help from us means
Yes,
they're more engaged.
I like that.
And I go, that's the simplest definition
It is.
ever, because you're not going, did I see the legs bend? Do I need to do more ground pulls? It's like we don't have to exaggerate it. Whenever going forward and making upward transitions is equal and easy to making downward transitions, then we know the horse is pretty well engaged, even if it doesn't look like there's a long stride or a fast speed. It's that equality between upward and downward transitions
Yes.
that is the result of genuine, authentic mechanical engagement of the horse's hindquarter. So as long as we're fighting speed too much or too little, our horse is not engaged to a minimal amount. Right? So if you think of basic moves, like you were saying, at a lower level of competition, they're kind of working on just simple transitions,
Yes.
right? So you're working walk, or you're working trot, or you're working canter, and then a transition between walk, trot, canter,
Yes.
right? When you get into the upper levels, this is where it starts to get hairy, because they want working, collected, and medium, and extended. So we're looking at leg strides. But I go, if you think of those as different gears, right? If we rev up the RPMs, right, in a car, but we don't have a lot of speed, that's like collection in a horse,
Mhm.
right? So we're not really going fast, but we're building power, right? The extension of the legs can only happen if the horse is using the hindquarters to control their body weight.
Yes.
If they're on the forehand, those front legs are never going to extend forward.
Yep.
I mean, the
And
horse
that
can,
is truly visual. That can
yes,
be a visual. I've seen horses standing with, like they were just going to fall on their face because their front legs were so far
backwards.
backwards. Backwards is
Yes.
a good, yeah.
The more weight the horse carries on the front end, the more the front legs have to go backwards to the middle, because the hind legs are
Support.
not coming forward towards the middle.
That's a physics thing. That's just basic physics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we increase the speed, thinking speed is going to give us engagement or speed is going to give us lift, then what we're doing is putting the hind legs always too far behind the horse's center.
Yes.
So then the front legs can't get off the ground, because one set of legs needs to be near the center or the horse is going to fall forward.
It's the same with people. Your center of mass has to be over your feet. It's that simple.
So that could be a definition of engagement for people.
Yeah.
It's like your pelvis has to be level in order to keep your center of mass over your feet, and not be ahead of your feet with your weight on your toes, or behind your feet with your weight on your heels.
Yes.
And what engagement gives us as humans is more range of motion through our legs.
Exactly.
So we can march, right? Which is like collection in a horse. We can march, which is not covering much ground, but we have more leg action. Or we can lengthen our stride, like if we're going to run hurdles, right? So we have a greater range of motion in the limbs when our center is balanced. So the
Yes.
engaging a horse's hindquarter just puts their center over the middle of like their center of gravity or their center point of balance more in their middle rather than too far forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. So I hope that helps people because it's a big deal. Like people are constantly changing bits, changing saddles, trying to get a fast horse to slow down, constantly going to spurs or whips or constant hammering with the legs to get a horse to go forward. And I go, really, it's the equality and the ease of the upward and downward transitions, right? So even if I start with a very disengaged horse and a rehab, I go, I can just work between walk and halt until it's equal, and I can improve the engagement.
It's that simple. As you don't have to be doing these big, long walk, trot, canter sessions. It can be really basic to get balance.
Absolutely. And even in lateral work or upper level maneuvers, to maintain the engagement, which is the weight control, becomes more critical. Yes. So you cover less ground, which means you're increasing the braking phase of the stride, not the pushing, right? The more engagement you want, the more deceleration or braking you want to let the hind leg come closer to the center.
Yes,
that's the phase of the stride. So I go, when I see people pushing horses to go faster and faster, thinking they're going to lift like an airplane, I go, it just doesn't work that way. Right? That isn't how the body works. It has to push and resist push with every stride. So it pushes forward and resists falling, pushes forward, resists falling.
Good explanation.
And we certainly would not want to drive a car without brakes.
Then we grind the gears.
Yeah, exactly. Or we can kind of downshift, but it's not, it's not healthy for the body. It's going to wreck the engine.
Right.
Right. So, and I'm not sure how to get back to how we started this conversation with engagement, but it's like, I think in thinking about engagement for this podcast, I was thinking about how I'm engaging with the world at large. And it kind of took me on this interesting mental emotional path of engagement. To go, am I engaging in a way that I'm balancing this braking and pushing?
That's a good point. I think that's a great question to leave for everybody to ask them to play with during their week. How am I engaging?
If we look at it as self-controlled, so it's self-propelled and self-controlled.
I like that.
I go, we could sort of take that into a mental emotional place and go, am I kind of exceeding what I can control? Right. And it didn't feel good. I think that's what I was doing is I go, I'm exceeding that sort of coming back feeling and replenishing with what I need to go out and do in the world. So my pushing was exceeding my braking. So I took a big downward transition and rested at halt for a little bit and went, okay.
Love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. But it is that balance because I go too much of one or the other is a disengagement.
Yes.
Right. And no matter what gear we want to be in, the engagement is the connection, which is that connection into self-control.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we'll leave it at that. We kind of wandered all over the place today. But what can you do? I feel more engaged now.
Good.
Okay. So thanks for joining us, everybody. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, thumbs up, all of those great things. And we will see you next time on the next Horse Geeks podcast.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.